In the game of chess, there are different stages that have been studied and even been given names. Now, these names aren't very creative, but still, there are distinguishable stages in the game. For instance, at the very beginning of the game, it's known as the opening. And many chess players memorize the moves that they're going to make for a good 10 to 12 moves. Once they get out of the opening, they are in what's called the mid game, and they use tactics to respond to the movements of their opponent. But by the end, they enter in what's known as the end game. And in debate, there are similar stages. For instance, the first couple of speeches by the leaders when they're giving their constructives, you could consider those the openings, in which both teams are laying out their strategy and their fundamental arguments. And when the members come up and give their speeches, that would be the mid game. But when you enter into the rebuttals, that's the end game. That's when you need to seal the deal. That's when you need to convince the judge to vote for your side or against the other. Ultimately, rebuttals are incredibly important speeches in the game of debate, and we're going to study them right now by first looking at the difference between offense and defense. Secondly, we're going to cover an idea known as impact calculus. And finally, talk about how to organize rebuttal speeches. The first important thing to understand about rebuttals is the difference between offense and defense. Many people are familiar with these two terms when it comes to like a sports analogy, so I'm going to roll with that. Let's think about basketball. That's one of the easiest analogies. You can have offense, which is actually putting the ball through the basket and scoring points. But you can prevent your opponents from scoring points themselves, and both of them are required in order to have a successful team and a winning outcome. The same thing is true in debate. In debate, you're scoring points for yourself. You're gaining favor with the judge, and they are going to be more likely to vote for you when you have offense. But you also want to prevent your opponents from gaining favor with the judge, and that's where defense comes in. Let's say you are on the affirmative. When you are giving your stock issues, making arguments, that is your offense. When you are answering disadvantages, for instance, no link, non-unique, answers like that, then that is your defense. So, you want to have both of these elements present within your debate. But my advice in rebuttals is for you to highlight the offense. Highlight it at the beginning and at the end. Just like in your constructive speeches, you want to have somewhat of a thesis, something that is the focus of your debate, of your rebuttal. And you want that focus to be the offense, but do not neglect the defense. You want to remind the judge that you have answered your opponent's arguments, that you have taken out their offense. And so that defense, those defensive arguments still need to be included, but do not highlight them as your thesis, because that is not how you're going to gain favor. That's not how you're going to win the round. You need to focus on the offense. So when you're on the affirmative, point out how you are winning all of your stock issues. When you are on the negative, you want to point out how you have successfully argued topicality or disadvantages or counterplans. But you also want to include somewhere in the middle, the meat of your rebuttal, explanations about how your defense is preventing your opponents from gaining the ballot in this round. Aside from offense and defense, the next important thing that people need to know about rebuttals is a concept known as impact calculus. Now, this sounds like a really fancy term, but it's pretty simple. Basically, what you're doing is trying to convince the judge that you have secured the most impacts in the round, that your arguments are heavier, they are weightier than your opponents. There are a couple of easy ways to do this, and they are broken down into probability and magnitude. These concepts should not be foreign to you. Probability means that there is a high likelihood that the impacts are going to happen. Now, remember, impacts could be good or bad. In the affirmative case, the impacts that you have are on your solvency, that you are explaining how many people are saved or how much suffering you reduce due to the plan that you are proposing, or just to the advocacy that you are in favor of. Even in a value round, there are still impacts, and the probability of those impacts happening are one way for you to convince the judge that they ought to vote on your side. The inverse of that is magnitude. Magnitude is just how large the impacts are, how important they are. This is why many debate rounds devolve into discussions about nuclear war, because nuclear war has a high magnitude impact. Lots of people are going to suffer. There's going to be massive amounts of death. The thing is, though, that nuclear war has a low probability. So you have to balance these two out. One reason why people don't vote in favor of the nuclear war scenario is specifically because of how low the probability is, especially considering what the topic is that you might be debating. Let's say the case was about increasing technology in schools, and somehow your opponent draws some link between including iPads for students and nuclear proliferation. That's a tenuous link and a very low probability, yet high magnitude impact. So in rebuttals, you might not be able to outweigh on the magnitude level, but you point out how incredibly low probability the disadvantage is, and that's a way for you to win in the rebuttals, for you to argue that your impacts about education outweigh nuclear war, not on magnitude, but on probability. You still want to argue the magnitude of your arguments, even if somebody is making a ridiculous claim to nuclear war. Regardless, these are two of the most stable ways to argue a rebuttal. The last thing, and perhaps the most difficult when it comes to rebuttals, is how do you organize this speech? The reason this is difficult is because you have been in a debate for half an hour, 45 minutes, discussing issues over and over again in a particular order. And oftentimes, debaters follow that order all the way through, even through rebuttals. I'm here to tell you that you might want to switch up the organization when it comes to rebuttals. It is a bad idea just to repeat the arguments in the order that everyone has been hearing them. The best thing for you to do is to prioritize these arguments. So, what you ought to do is create a list of voters. Now, voters are critical elements within the debate that ought to result in a ballot one way or the other. Typical voters include topicality, a high magnitude disadvantage, fulfilling stock issues. These things are typical voting issues, and you can explain why you're winning those on a multitude of different levels. Even if you are on the affirmative, perhaps you have argued successfully to turn a disadvantage. That turn in and of itself can be a voter, and you can make that into its own issue. You could prioritize that as the most important issue in the round. I urge you not to just follow the organization that you have been following throughout the round. It is impossible. You can't cover everything. Not only that, if you try to, you're more than likely going to lose the judge's attention. So divide up the entire debate into 3 or 4 voters and divide up the time that you spend on each in the rebuttal equally. Prioritize those voters into a hierarchy. Start with the most important one. Your best argument should be the one that begins the rebuttal. And the rebuttal should sound like this. If you don't vote for the first voter, then you can vote for the second. And even if you don't vote for the second, then you can vote for the third. This even if pattern that you develop is kind of like setting up a gauntlet that the opposition has to go through in order to successfully win this round. It sets it up as sounding as if there is a lot of work that the judge has to do in order to vote for your opponent. Make it sound as though there are multiple reasons to vote for you by organizing your rebuttal into voters, not just regurgitating the round thus far. So there you have it. 3 basic strategies on how to approach rebuttals: offense versus defense, impact calculus, and organization based on voters. Debate and chess hold a lot of similarities, and one of those similarities is how each of those go through different stages. The rebuttals are just like the endgame in chess, incredibly important. If you want to win the game in chess, and if you want to win in debate, you gotta know how to close. And rebuttals are your chance to shine. Make sure that you make these memorable, that you focus on the critical issues. You can't cover everything. Rebuttal speeches are very short, and the debate to this point was very long. Don't even try to cover all the arguments, just the most important ones. Make sure you balance your offense and defense. Make sure that you have probability and magnitude, and make sure that your voters shine.